Good evening, everyone. And tonight we are going to be talking about wisdom literature. We're going to be talking about wisdom literature in the Bible, and also the parallels and kind of mainly the parallels that we have in the ancient Near East and Egypt. So not just the ancient Near East, Egypt as well, because there's a very strong parallel between one specific Egyptian piece of wisdom literature and Mishle, Proverbs. So we're going to be looking at that. In fact, I think we're going to start with that. But first, I'm going to start with a definition of what do we call wisdom literature? What do we call wisdom literature? In the narrower sense, wisdom literature are texts that are written specifically for a purpose of teaching or erudition in terms of morality or wisdom. Okay, so you could easily put Mishle, Proverbs, in that category. You could easily put something like Job, in that category, because it's making a certain message about kind of a theological reality, that it's not prophecy, it's not some kind of biblical interpretation, it stands on its own, even though you have a narrative. So wisdom literature can come along with a narrative. In the ancient world, it frequently did come along with a narrative to explain why you're getting all this wisdom from someone. But we also books like Tehillim, like the Psalms, contain chapters, contain prakim that we would consider wisdom literature, really, right? And sometimes they contain just verses that are like wisdom literature. So we have the first things you think about in Tanakh, in the Bible classically, is you think about Kohelet, right? You think about Mishle, about Proverbs, Job. Those are usually the big ones that come to mind, and to a lesser extent, Tehillim, Psalms, because you have that come through sometimes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the parallels we see in the ancient world, and what that can kind of tell us in terms of the similarities and differences with biblical wisdom literature. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to look at the handouts I sent you, and I'm going to start really from the beginning. So I'll share my screen first. Why is it not letting me share my screen? Here we are. Okay, here we are. Here's your handout, and it's we took it from the context of scripture. Of course, you can get these texts in numerous places, but it's nice. I actually like the context of scripture because I like this introduction by Miriam Lichtheim. It's nice. She points out some of the biblical parallels, so I thought it was a good thing to include. So if we start, for example, and actually let's actually here, let me get out of this. So here we have an introduction. Now, what is the Amenemope text? It is an Egyptian text. We have it in multiple copies. In its most complete copy is the British Museum papyrus. That is also the latest copy. Okay, so when we date it, so the copies of this text are okay. The earliest would be 1069 BCE, and the latest would be 500 BCE. Okay. However, it's still dated. People usually date the composition of the text to earlier than text 1069. They date it to the Ramessid period, right? To Ramses, more or less. Okay, so if we're talking about that, I'm looking at I never like to say, as you know, I never like to say dates by heart. So I'm just looking for my Ramses dates. Here we are. Here we are, almost there. Okay. So Ramses II is 1279 to 1213. Wow. So Ramses II, 1279 to 1213. That's more or less where we dated. The Ramesside period is actually considered like the 1300 to 1075, and that's when we usually date the composition. Most people date the composition of this work, even though all the copies are later. And the most complete one is a lot later, is around 500 BCE. That's the latest copy. That's the most complete one. That's the one we use, actually, and that's much, much later, right? That would actually kind of take us to the Second Temple period pretty much. So we're close to it. So if we go to, so if we look, okay, prologue, beginning the teaching for life, you'll see if we just read this, even if we read this without having Mishlei, without having Proverbs next to it, when we say, he says, give your ears, hear the sayings, give your heart to understand them. It profits to put them in your heart. Woe to him who neglects them. Let them rest in the casket of your belly. May they be bolted in your heart. It already sounds like that. We've all recognized things. Now it's even more startling when we see it next to Mishlei. So let me see if that will work. Only kind of. Let's try that here. Okay, so if we have, here we have chapter 1 of Amenemope, right? And here we have Proverbs. Can everyone see Mishlei next to it? Can you see that? So we're looking at Parakuf Bet at chapter 22, okay? And if we flip here to Pasuk, here, to Pasuk Yud Zayin to verse 17. So again, I'm going to say this again. We're in Chaf Bet Yud Zayin. That's 22:17. And here we have Hat oznecha ushma divrei chachamim v'libcha tashit ledaati. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge. And in the Egyptian text, give your ears, hear the sayings, give your heart to understand them. Okay, apply your heart, right? So we have listen to your ear, hear the sayings, hear the words, and apply your heart, right? The same, totally parallel. Okay. And then we have in Mishlei, we have Kinaim, Kitishmerim, Bevitnecha, keep them in your belly, let them rest in the casket of your belly. That's the Egyptian. In other words, it's unbelievably parallel. This section of Mishlei is unbelievably parallel to Amenemope. You can just kind of go back and forth and see the parallels, right? So it really looks, and people do treat it this way, like one is reliant on the other. There's some who want to say they're both reliant on some kind of Semitic forebear, okay? But it looks like if you would date the Egyptian text to Ramses, we would expect Mishlei to be later, no matter how you're dating it, right? So then Mishlei would be based on either the Egyptian text or some development on that was itself based on the Egyptian text, right? So we have this really strong parallel. And then we even continue, we say in chapter 2, beware of robbing a wretch, of attacking a cripple. Here, rob not the weak because he is weak, neither crush the poor in the gate, right? In other words, as soon as it finishes, if you look at this, if you compare these two texts, right? So the beginning is saying, listen to this wisdom because it's a good thing to do. Keep it in you'll listen to your heart, you'll listen to your heart, keep it in your stomach. Things that are unusual in the Hebrew, a little unusual to like keep it in your stomach, and a clear parallel to the Egyptian. Okay. And then and some, certain and other, there are certain other aspects that are also parallel. And then as we continue on, the first thing it says is don't rob the weak. And in the Egyptians, beware of robbing a wretch or attacking a cripple. Okay. Don't stretch out your hands to touch an old man or open your mouth to an elder. Okay. And then it continues on, don't let yourself be sent to the messenger, or don't raise an outcry against one who attacks you. And where it goes on in Mishlei is make no friendship with a man who is given to anger, and with a wrathful man thou shalt not go. Okay, so it continues on to be fairly parallel also in terms of the ideas. Now, of course, it's important to note the differences, right? Because the idea, what's interesting is, let's take a quick look, for example, in the Egyptian, why should you not raise an outcry against one who attacks you or answer him yourself? Because he who does evil, the shore rejects him. Its flood water carries him away. In other words, whoever is evil is going to get theirs. Okay, I'm going to continue on in the Egyptian. I mean, English, obviously, it's a translation of the Egyptian. Okay. It continues on. You heated man, how are you now? He cries out, his voice reaches heaven. It is the moon who declares his crime. Steer, we will ferry the wicked. We do not act like his kind. Lift him up, give him your hand, leave him in the hands of the God. fill his belly with bread of your own, let he be sated and weep. Okay. Another thing good in the heart of the God to pause before speaking. Okay. Don't talk too fast. We were just adding things. Also to a certain extent, it's a little bit more connected than some places in Mishlei, but you all know the kind of joke, right? That if you read Tehillim and Psalms, no chapter is connected to the next chapter, right? And in Mishlei and Proverbs, no verse is connected to the next verse. And in Eov and Job, no word is connected to the next word. So that's the joke. And certainly with Mishlei, we see that a lot, where you kind of just jump to the next topic. But here, actually, in the parallel section, the parts that are parallel to Amenemope, we do kind of see more of a theme for a little bit longer sometimes. But the idea is, it's much clearer if we look. Now I'm switching to Mishlei. Let's take a look on the right here. Why? Okay, so the idea that being in wisdom is to be with God, with the Lord, right? With Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, right? Is a very central idea in Mishlei. It's brought up over and over and over again. Okay, so and here, why should you not steal from the poor, right? Because he's poor, right? So don't steal from the poor. He's poor. You should not oppress the weak. And what's for self-serving people? Why? For the Lord will plead their cause and despoil of life those that despoil them. I would say, yeah, that's a pretty decent translation, actually. And so God is going to kill the people who oppress the poor. So that's a good reason to not oppress the poor. Whereas in the Egyptian text, that's much less. Yeah, you have kind of gods coming in a little bit, but it's much more like bad things will happen to the wicked, right? Bad things will happen to the wicked, without saying a single god is going to do it. Now there are other texts that are more, let's say, religious, but that's a big difference that we see throughout. Another very interesting parallel. Not exactly parallel. In Mishlei Chaf Bet Chaf Gimel, no, that's not right. That's strange. I have it written. Just a second. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, I see. Hold on. It's Chaf Bet Chaf. So this is an interesting idea we have here. If you look at the number of chapters that we have in Amenemope, let me flip through. We can see how many chapters do we have? 30. We have 30 chapters, and it says, look to these 30 chapters. They inform, they educate. Now let's look at our verse in Mishlei and Proverbs. Halo chatavti lecha shalishim shloshim. What does it say there? We don't know. They wrote it shalshom, right? Because what is this, right? I wrote you 30, perhaps 30 in counsels of and knowledge, right? So if you're looking at this and you're looking at how parallel it is to Amenemope, if that's 30, then that's even more, right? I'm just, anyone who's just looking at the translation, it's not being translated. It says, have not I written. It's reading it. I guess it's reading it shalshom, that I have done it like the day before yesterday. It's noticed that we have what's called a kriyuchtiv. You read one thing and it's something else is written. So what's written here is shalshom, the day before yesterday, and what we read is shalishim, right? Maybe triple. You could be, if we're reading it shloshim, it would be very easy, by the way, to read this word shloshim, if that was in fact what was written and what became shalshom later in the writing. Shloshim would be 30. And it's an interesting explanation of a hard to understand kriyuchtiv. Now, note that one of the sources of kriyuchtiv, of having one written version and one read version, is certainly according to Radak. I always pull out Radak so people don't say I'm not Pikaris, but certainly according to Radak, there are different manuscripts, right? They had different manuscripts in front of them. They didn't know which one was right. They didn't feel they could make a decision that one was the right one, so they wrote one and read the other. Now, in certain cases, that's true. In certain cases, you see other reasons for kriuchtiv. This is a word that's considered very crude, so you don't say it, right? Like the words with shagal, shin gimel lamed, as the root that are changed to shachav, slept with, because the shin gimel lamed root shagal is considered very crude to say. So you'll see that as a kriuchtiv, where you have one thing written and you say something else. But you also have situations where it's quite clear that there were different texts and they weren't sure which was right. Now, in fact, if someone wrote shloshim here, you would have gotten this text. And you could also completely understand how someone would copy it shloshim. If you remember that Yud and Vav, particularly in Second Temple, Hebrew, look very similar to each other, very similar. They can really very similar. And shloshim made no sense. If you don't know Amenemope, what in the 30s times 3, what, why, what, right? So they wrote down shloshim, right? I told you this, since the day before yesterday, right? But it's another thing that points to some kind of influence somehow between Amenemope and the and Mishlei and Proverbs, at least this section. Now, this section is interesting. Let me make sure I'm getting the right verse. Oh, so late. So I'm going to refer to this other verse later. How would Egyptian texts get to a court producing Mishlei? Okay. Now, first, let's talk about where does Mishlei come from. Okay. So traditionally, Mishlei is written by Shlomo, by Solomon, right? Shlomo HaMelech, he writes Mishlei, he writes Proverbs, and that's, I mean, if if we look, it says right in the beginning, Mishlei Shlomo ben David, right? These are the Proverbs of Shlomo, the son of David. Okay, so he gets credit for the Proverbs. He's supposed to be super wise, that we have in all the traditions. He's really wise, and he writes the Proverbs. Now, interestingly enough, someone who did a lot of work on parallels between biblical wisdom literature and Egyptian literature is Nili Chopak. She teaches at Haifa University. She's probably retired now. She taught at Haifa University. I learned with her, and she looked at, her theory was that there were two ways that there could have been a kind of a dialogue, you could say, between Egyptian wisdom school and, let's call it, a Judean wisdom school. Judean is Israelite wisdom school. Okay, and that was both the scribal school and the royal court. Okay, what do I mean? And this is pretty well known that scribes had a culture where there was a lot of cultural exchange between scribes. You see certain things that kind of seem to be transmitted among scribes, and that the scribal school would therefore have access to Egyptian scribal literature and would be more familiar with it. And then from the scribal school, it might make sense. Another possibility that she raised is the fact that there were royal connections with the Egyptian court. Famously, Shlomo marries an Egyptian princess, right? And that's a big deal. In fact, what she used to say was that he's one the king called Hamelech Hagadol, the great king. And that's something that you usually could only call the Egyptian king, the Egyptian pharaoh. Like that, the great king was a title for the Egyptian pharaoh. We call it Shlomo. We call Shlomo that. And Shlomo actually reached a real diplomatic height. Let me actually stop sharing for a second. He reached a real diplomatic height when he managed to marry an Egyptian princess. This wasn't something that was easy to do. Egyptians didn't marry their princesses off to just about anyone. Everyone wanted, Egypt was super important, not because they were a tremendous empire and military might and military power, and B, because they had a lot of gold. Everyone wanted that gold. So they would send all sorts of stuff to get the gold. Please give us gold. Everyone wanted the gold, and Egypt had a lot of it. So having an alliance with Egypt was a really big deal. Having an alliance by marriage was a bigger deal. We even have places where the pharaoh is absolutely refusing to send an Egyptian princess in a marriage deal to another king. So that's a big deal. And then you have that meeting of the courts. There's clearly a diplomatic alliance there. You don't have to say that the princess herself brought the wisdom literature, but you would say that that having a connection like that means you've got some real diplomatic connections in the royal court. And what's interesting also is that if we look on in Proverbs, I guess I'll share my screen now again briefly. Here we are. And so if we look at in Mishlei Chaf Hey, oh, it's going to be a bit. Hold on, let me see if I can. No, where were we? Okay. So if we look at Mishlei Chaf Hey, that's chapter 25, we'll see that a whole section of Mishlei of Proverbs is actually attributed to the men of Chizkiyahu, right? That these are also Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Chizkiyahu, king of Yehuda, copied out, right? So these came out of the court of Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu was also famously allied with Egypt, which is a problem that Yeshayahu had with him, right? That he was allied with Egypt. So Chizkiyahu was allied with Egypt as well. So at the same time, you have possibly a scribal connection between scribes of different, within the scribal school. You also have royal connections. You have connections to Egypt in the royal court. So that could be how you have such strong parallels between particularly Amenemope and Mishlei. Okay. So that's the Egyptian parallel. There are other Egyptian texts that are very interesting, but they're maybe less parallel. So I'm going to move on to the more, actually, before I move on, I do want to say a couple other things that Neely Chopak noted. Besides the fact that we do have this real prominence in Mishlei of God, of like the Israelite God, of Yud Kei Vav Kei, of the Lord, right? He has this very important role to play in why you shouldn't do crappy things. All right. And I just wanted, because this is going to come up later when we talk about Job, when we talk about Eov. Please realize that what's set up in Mishlei is if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. Okay. That's the way Mishlei works. It's not the way other biblical wisdom literature works. And it's not the way other ancient Near Eastern or Egyptian wisdom literature works. Across wisdom literature in Egypt and in the ancient Near East, we see absolutely a dealing with bad things happening to good people. Okay, and that's what we're going to jump into next. As soon as I wet my throat a little, we're going to jump into next when we talk about some of the Babylonian and one small Ugaritic parallel that we have to this, to dealing with bad things happening to good people. So I'm going to pause for a second. Let me stop sharing for now, and look if there are any questions. I see there's one chat. Okay, excuse me just a second. Okay. Does 25:1, and this is from Moshe Matitya, does 25:1 imply that Chizkiyahu's scribes wrote down proverbs that had been attributed to Shlomo in an oral tradition? I think that is the implication, actually. Or I mean, you could say, like, the question is, when they wrote that, what did they mean, right? Did they mean that? It sounds like that. That's what it sounds like they meant to say. Chizkiyahu, we know that this was actually written down by Chizkiyahu's scribes, but they came from Shlomo. How did they get to the scribes? Well, it was passed down in the scribal school, or in the royal whatever, right? But it was written down by Chizkiyahu's guys. It wasn't written down by Shlomo, but there's still problems with Shlomo, right? So that seems to be what the implication is. Anyone else want to add a question before we move on? Okay, so we're going to move on to our next text. So in our next text, what we're going to be looking at is, first what we're going to look at is a sufferer's salvation. Let me share my screen with you once again. Okay, by the way, do you guys see the images of everyone, or do I just see the images of everyone when you see the shared screen? Silence, which is good because it means everyone's muted, but
I see the images of everyone.
okay, so I'm gonna let me minimize that. Okay, so I'm minimizing it. There you go. Okay. All right. So here we have, and this is in your handouts. Okay, it's a Sefer Salvation is of course not the official name. It's not the actual name of this text. This text is interesting because it comes from Ugaritic. Okay, just to remind you, in terms of Ugaritic, the heyday of Ugaritic is around 1375 to 1175 BCE. Okay, so we're talking about, excuse me, the Bronze Age. All right, so we're talking well before we have an Israelite kingdom or a Judahite kingdom or anything like that. And this actually, to me, is most reminiscent of certain psalms, of certain Tehillim. Okay, so here he's talking about how everything was against him. Okay, my omens were obscure. The diviner could not reach a ruling concerning me. The judge would give no sign. Let me actually put my little spotlight on. Okay. The omens were confused, the oracles mixed up, dream interpreters used up the incense, diviners the lambs, learned men debated the tablets. Essentially what's going on is everything's awful, okay? So everything's awful until the Lord raised my head and brought me back to life from the dead, until Marduk raised my head and brought me back to life from the dead. I could eat scant bread, I took from my drink bilge and salt pools. When I lay down, sleep would not overcome me. I would lie awake. Even in the pattern, we have this a lot in Tehillim and Psalms where everything was bad and then God helped me. And then we go back to describing how terrible things were. Okay. My tears had to serve as my sustenance, lest Marduk be forgotten, that Marduk be praised. Were it not for Marduk, breath had gone from me. Would not the mourner have cried out, alas for him? I praise what the Lord Marduk has done. I praise. Okay. Praising. He scuttled me, then moored me. He dashed me down, then grabbed me. He scattered me wide, then guarded me. He served me. This idea of he snatched the jaw of death. He raised me up from hell. God threw me away, and then he grabbed me back. If you will think in terms of the psalm that we have in the book of Jonah, it's a very similar kind of idea. So if we look at, let's see if I can quickly get it. Oh, I cannot quickly get it. That's annoying. But let's see if I can find it. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay. All right. Here. And he said, I called out of my, now this whole little thing really reads like a psalm. And it's in fact, many think that it was actually something that would have been said by sailors who were lost at sea or who were saved from a sea accident. So he said, I called out, Karati mitzarali el Hashem v'yaneni, right? I called out to God and he answered me, right? I cried out from the belly of the netherworld, right? And you heard my voice. For you did cast me in the depths. God did this to me, and then he saved me. Okay. And you have the same idea in this Ugaritic text that in this case it's Marduk. Marduk, he dashed me and then he grabbed me. He scattered me, then he garnered me. Right? This idea that both my misfortune and my salvation came from God. Okay. Now let's move on. And I mean, it's interesting because you would understand this more in the context of monotheism, right? Everything has to come from God, right? Whereas in you would say, well, with Marduk, can't they just blame something else? But at least in this text, that's not the way it's working. Let me, I hope this does not bode well. I see why. Okay, that's fine. All right, so that's the suffer salvation. Now, what I really wanted to get to here, just a moment. There we go. Okay. So that was a suffer salvation. That's from Ugaritic. Now remember that Ugaritic is Northwest Semitic. It's really the closest thing that you would have to biblical everything, but earlier. All right. Now what we're looking at is the Babylonian Theodicy. The Babylonian Theodicy is from around 1000 BCE. Okay. So that we're talking about, say, pre-monarchic Israel. Okay, would be kind of the parallel time frame for the biblical world. Okay, so in this we actually see something very similar to the setup in Eov, not the setup that the Satan got God to do something to him. Remember that narrative frame was not necessarily always connected to the poetic core. So here, if we see here, if it's a dialogue between the sufferer and a friend, not numerous friends, but one friend. And the sufferer is maintaining also that he has not done anything. And the friend is saying, you're not thinking straight, okay? But it's a little bit more, well, first of all, it's much shorter than Eov. It's much shorter than Job. And possibly because it's much shorter, it feels much more consistent. That you actually see the friend. Obviously for the friends make different arguments in Eov also. They just tend to repeat. So here you have considerate friend. He says, I am without recourse. This is the sufferer. Where's the counselor to whom I can tell of woe? I'm without recourse. Heartache has come upon me. I was the youngest child when fate claimed my father. My mother, who bore me, departed the land of no return. My father and mother left me, and with no one my guardian. Friend, considerate friend, what you tell is a sorrowful tale. My dear friend, you have let your mind harbor ill. You make your estimable discretion feeble-minded. In other words, you're being a bit of an idiot now. You alter your bright expression to a scowl. Of course, our fathers pay passage to go death's way. I too will cross the river of the dead, as is commanded from of old. When you survey teeming mankind altogether, the poor man's son advanced, someone helped him get rich. Who did favors for the sleek and wealthy? He who looks to his God has a protector. The humble man who reveres his goddess will garner wealth. So here it's very clear he's making two arguments. One, everyone dies. Like your parents die because everyone dies. And what do you do if you have nothing? You look to your God, and then you're going to be able to gain wealth, right? And then the sufferer goes on about how crappy everything is, right? For him specifically, all right? And the friend is saying, you're being an idiot. And it kind of looked to the gods once more. That sounds very familiar to us with Eov, where the most common thing saying is that even though what they're saying is you must have sinned, right? What the friends in general, and I know I'm making a generality, but the friends in Eov and Job in general say is they're applying they're applying the formula that Mishlei, the Proverbs, gives everyone. Okay, the formula that Mishlei gives you is that if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. Which means if you're getting bad, what is true? You must have done bad, right? So if you apply that formula and you believe that formula is it, that's what you get. And that's what the friends in Eov are doing. They're applying that formula. And the point of Eov is that no, that formula doesn't work. And we'll come to that in this text as well. Okay. So if we look at this text and say, okay, so it goes on, he continues, and then the sufferer goes beyond his individual suffering, and he starts talking about how things are unfair, right? the savage lion that devoured the choicest meat, did it bring its offerings to appease a goddess's anger? In other words, it got the great meat because it's hot, it's savage, not because it did something good for the gods. The parvenu who multiplies his wealth, it really annoyed them to have these nouveau riche people. Like that was something that really annoyed them apparently in the ancient Near East. It's interesting to me because you have this kind of as this repeating theme that you have this nouveau riche person, this person who just came into his wealth. How did that happen, right? Did he weigh out precious gold to the mother goddess for a family? Have I withheld my offerings? And this is where he's going to talk about how righteous he is. Where I said the blessing over my goddess, my speech, and we're missing things. Okay. And the friend then says, well, bad things bad people get bad things, and bad animals get bad things, right? Come look at that lion you call to mind, the enemy of livestock. For the atrocity that lion committed, the pit yawns for him. The well-heeled parvenu who treasured up possessions, the king will put him to the flames before his time. Like, just wait. Everything, and again, using that formula, not of Proverbs, because this is a Babylonian work, right? But it's not using the Proverbs formula, but it is using this idea of bad things happen to the bad, good things happen to the good, stop complaining, right? And the sufferer says, oh, you have great reasoning, right? He's applying the formula perfectly, right? But let me put one matter before you. Those who seek not after a god can go the road of favor. Those who pray to a goddess have grown poor and destitute. So he's saying, this is a classic. This is Habakkuk says. Like, this is, if you really want to look for a place where someone in the Bible says, wicked people are prospering, good people are suffering, and it's not flippant, right? Habakkuk is your guy, right? So you can take a look at Habakkuk and see him really, really saying, we see that this is not working, right? And that's what the sufferer is saying here. I'm not saying that Habakkuk and this text are at all connected. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that these ideas are out there and they're being commonly addressed, and addressing them through a dialogue was a very common thing in ancient Near Eastern and frankly also Egyptian literature. Okay, to have a dialogue to explore these things. Okay, and so here the sufferer is saying, I was really good, but cripple, right? I remember, and note, he's not saying I helped other people. His big thing is I did pray to the goddess. I prayed to the goddess. I brought, I bore a yoke of profitless servitude. My God decreed for me poverty instead of wealth. A cripple rises above me. A fool is ahead of me. Rogues are in the ascendant. I am demoted. Okay. And then the friend pulls out what they generally don't pull out in Eov, and what God himself kind of pulls out in Eov, which is you can't understand the gods, right? The strategy of a god is remote as innermost heaven, right? The command of the gods cannot be drawn out. Teeming humanity well understands trouble, and then we're missing something, but it sounds like what he's saying is, well, gods are a mystery, right? And we have that almost as a solution in Eov. Right. Well, what happens is God comes out and is like, you guys have no clue how I work. Stop deciding how I work. Don't tell Eov, that he sinned. You have no idea how I work. Right. And just because bad things are happening to him does not mean he sinned. Supporting again my hypothesis that Eov, that Job is written not to comfort sufferers, but to tell the friends of sufferers not to be jerks and not to say the sufferer sinned, right? Not to apply this formula when they see a sufferer. You can't do that. You have no idea why they're suffering. The fact is they're suffering, and you don't know. They could be wonderful. It could be amazing, okay? And then the sufferer says, I'm gonna forsake my home. I'm gonna do all sorts of crappy things. I'm going to stave off hunger by breaking into others' houses. The friend's like, don't do that. Okay. Eventually, again, the sufferer talks about how unfair everything is. And what it seems to be at the end is that the friend says, well, all these gods and little king, and I'm reading now the very end, and little king of the gods who created teeming mankind, majestic Io who pinched off their clay, the queen who fashioned them, mistress Mami, gave twisted words to the human race. They endow them in perpetuity with lies and falsehood. Solemnly they speak well of a rich man, they meaning people. They speak well of a rich man. He's the king, they say. He has much wealth. They malign a poor man as a thief. They lavish mischief upon him. They conspire to kill him. They make him suffer every evil because he has no wherewithal. They bring him to a horrible end. They snuff him out like an ember. And what this final solution seems to be is saying, well, it's people. It's people. The gods actually did give the ability to lie to people. So you can kind of lay that at the feet of the gods. And then people lie and they cause all this pain and horror. Okay. And the sufferer kind of says, okay, you're sympathetic. You are sympathetic, my friend. Be considerate of my misfortune. Help me see my distress. You should be cognizant of it. And then he finally ends, may the God who has cast me off grant help. May the goddess who has forsaken me take pity. The shepherd Shamash will pasture people as a god should. Right. So he ends with an appeal to the gods. Once the friend says, yeah, seems to be more sympathetic and also recognize that on the one hand, this is caused by human evil. On the other hand, gods let the people, gave them these lying words, which is very interesting. It's interesting to see that the kind of theological development that you see in this Babylonian work, again from around 1000 BCE. And it does explore different solutions to this problem of theodicy. And it does, let me stop the share for a second. And it does also show us that theodicy is not just a problem for monotheists. Okay, everyone always wanted to believe that the gods either are good or can be controlled, right? So if you look at the text that we just read, the idea seems to be not that, as opposed to what we usually think of in terms of what God wants, that you would say, I was always good, I gave charity, right? That's the sort of thing that Job says, like, I did good things, I did, like, I was a good person, right? I also prayed to God, I also brought sacrifices, I did all the stuff, right? And that's why I should be rewarded and not punished. Where this guy is pretty much saying, I served the gods. Don't say I didn't serve the gods. Don't say I didn't pray to my goddess. I prayed to the goddess. Don't say I didn't bring sacrifices. I brought sacrifices. Did that lion bring sacrifices? That lion did not bring sacrifices, right? That's the way to get rewarded, is to serve the god. And it's like a slot machine, right? Except there should always be 3 cherries if you put in the money. So that's the idea there of that's what being kind of good is. That's what being doing the right thing is. But that's always been across cultures. There is this issue of how do we explain bad things happening to good people or bad things happening to people who did everything right. Okay, so it's not just a problem of monotheism. The difference is that if you are a polytheist, you do have an easy solution, which people don't seem to want to take that much, which is to say, well, there's an evil God. Right? There's an evil God who also has power, or evil demons who also have power, and they're doing things, and that's what explains all the evil, right? So sometimes you see that, and sometimes you don't. Yes, Joel.
Well, in Gnosticism, it would have become a world religion if Christianity didn't come around, and the God of the
Gnosticism is after Christianity. Gnosticism is really weird. It's not that Christianity came around. Gnosticism is a very weird and weirdly anti-Semitic offshoot of Christianity in a weird way. Like can't have Gnosticism without having Christianity.
But there were Jewish Gnostics, there were Christian Gnostics.
You know what? The whole theory of Jewish Gnostics is very iffy.
The brother of Jesus, like James.
They may have said that they're from brother. They were not that. Gnostics were not that early. Gnostics were really weird. And again, it was a very anti-Semitic approach. Like if you say, okay, the Hebrew Bible God is actually evil, that are a lot of steps that Jews are not going to take, right? Like that's way beyond even saying that Jesus is Messiah, or even saying that Jesus is God, to start saying, oh, you know what? That the Hebrew God is actually evil. No. Like, I mean, as a bunch of monks, they had a lot of time on their hands, and a lot of time to get into like really weird, wacky theories, If I listen to YouTube videos a lot long enough, I believe in all sorts of conspiracies. But I think that I'm not an expert in Gnosticism. There's a lot of Gnosticism that has a very long history, but it doesn't go that early. Like it doesn't predate Christianity. Okay. So Yeah. Now, obviously, Gnosticism is a way of dealing with evil. Sure, it's a fairly unique way of dealing with evil. It really. I mean, you have the Greek demiurge, right?
Well,
And the
Plato.
demiurge, right? The demiurge allows kind of evil to kind of come in because he's not like it. There's this idea. It's less, not so much evil, but like even like Philo, who's a Jewish philosopher living towards the end of the Second Temple period, right? And he's a Middle Platonist. He's kind of running off Plato and the Timaeus. So Plato and the Timaeus says, how do you have, why can people do bad? Essentially, he's explaining this, is that there were all these kind of like little helper gods, right? And they got involved in making people. So the people weren't perfect. And Philo uses that kind of explanation to explain Na'aseh Adam, let us make man. Who is the us? Angels. God with the angels. The angels got involved in making man, and that's why man is capable of doing evil, because he wasn't only made by God. Now that is like, whoa. But Philo he's working off an interpretation. He's really working off the Septuagint. The Septuagint also, despite what the Gemara says, the Septuagint that we have and that we know of does translate "let us make man." It doesn't translate it that verse in singular. You know, there's a in the Talmud, that's one of the things that they fixed, right? They didn't translate that correctly. Unfortunately, every text we've got translates that as "let us make man." Every Septuagint, every kind of Greek text that we know of. I should say we don't have that many that go that far back. To say that there was no text that corrected it, I would completely believe. If you found a Greek text that corrected it, I'd be like, wow, that's cool. And I wouldn't particularly doubt it, because that's the sort of thing that they would do. You could totally see them correcting a problematic text that way. But the Septuagint, in fact, translated that into Greek, "let us make man." Philo, who was working off the Bible in Greek, had to explain it as he would have had to explain it in Hebrew. And he used Plato's idea, and to good effect, right? How, it's great because it explains the verse and it explains people doing evil, right? It's not really meant, at least what Philo is doing is not really meant to explain evil happening to people. It's just why people do evil. I see that someone added something. Hashem Ori Vishi Tehillim 27:10. Avi V'lami Azavuni. I'm gonna have to look at it. I have to look at it in Hebrew. It's hard for me to read it in the thing. Any connection with the text you dealt with today? Let me take a look. It's Tehillim 27:10. I will take a look. Hold on. Okay. 26. Oh, yeah. Okay. I know, but I don't know things by heart like that. So, ki aviv imi azavuni v'Hashem yasfeni. That's very interesting. So I assume what you're saying is we just read a text where the sufferer is saying, "My father and mother died," right? And this verse is saying, because my parents left me and God gathered me in. I think it's the general idea of abandonment and having nothing. I don't think that I think it's very interesting that is kind of the classic sadness, the classic tragedy of someone is being an orphan, particularly in the beginning of life, because that's like a tragedy that's happening to a young person. So I think that's the idea is of being abandoned and helpless, and God helped me. I think is that it's an interesting parallel, but I think it reflects more what it means to be an orphan, and that feeling and the idea that God helped me even when I was so low. It is similarly to the chapter in Yechezkel where you were left in your blood. You're living in your blood was a way in the ancient Near East to say that you had not been adopted, you had been abandoned and not adopted. When people used to say adopted, when there was a trial, right? The birth mother, they adopted a kid, and the birth mother was the wet nurse, which was apparently a fairly common situation, and also something that you would not be surprised that she wanted to keep the baby. She gave up the baby, then she had to nurse the baby, and then she wanted to keep the baby. She didn't want to give the baby back when she was finished, weaning the baby. And they said, no, we adopted the baby in its blood, meaning no one cleaned it. You gave birth to it, we took it and we cleaned it. We adopted it in its blood, right? And God's like, you were there kind of in your blood, right? For a baby, all the nations around you, no one took you in. God himself doesn't adopt us. God himself doesn't adopt us, right? But they're not, but the you're going to live in your blood. God doesn't adopt us. Why doesn't God adopt us? Because he's got to marry us, right? Because we grow up to be a young lady and then God marries us, right? In that metaphorical situation in Yechezkel. So the idea is that we had no one. And why is it important that it be a marriage and not an adoption? Allow me this, and I will come back to the wisdom text. Why is it important that be a marriage and not an adoption? Because choice is involved. There's an idea that we had to choose God as well, as opposed to, and also not just choice. I'm actually being a little bit too political. Not just choice. The idea is there's a covenant. We owe God something, right? When you're a child, you don't really owe your parents anything. If you're 3, you don't really owe your parents much, right? You can't, no parent can say, that's it. That's the last time you spill your milk on the floor, you're out, 3-year-old. No parents are not supposed to say that, right? There's no covenant that the kid owes the parent. And because of that, the relationship that Yechezkel is portraying in that passage has to be one where, as adults, quote unquote, we entered into a covenant with God where we owe God loyalty, right? As one would in a marriage, right? We owe God something. We've entered into a covenant, right? Anyway, okay, so back to our wisdom literature. So if we talk, where were we at? Yes, so we were talking about the Babylonian, right? The Babylonian Theodicy. So in this Babylonian Theodicy, as we saw, what's happening is that there's someone suffering, and they're trying to explain how he could suffer, and yet the gods aren't evil, right? The gods aren't evil, and the conclusion, it's not clear if it's supposed to be a conclusion or several arguments. In other words, if we're supposed to take the friend's argument to say, oh, each one is a good point, right? And the final argument seems to be, well, the gods did give people the ability to lie and be awful, and that can cause awfulness, right? But the really final point of that text is that he appeals to the gods. The real final point of the text is that he appeals to the gods to help him. Here I am, you've rejected me, please help me, right? In Eov, it's a different setup. Not only there are multiple friends, et cetera, but what seems to solve the issue is God actually coming out, right? And saying, here I am, friends, you're wrong, shut up because you have no idea how I work. And Eov is satisfied simply with the fact that God actually came out and answered him. The fact that God came out and answered him is the solution for Eov, right? That solves the issue because God acknowledged him. And also what it does is it tells the friends, no, you can't make that equation. So let's just go and continue with some of our final texts here. Obviously there are many wisdom texts that we could look at, but I wanted to look at the ones that had the closest or most interesting parallels. So I'm going to go back to our text. Here we are. Okay. So what we have here, this is interesting because it's not exactly Kohelet-like, and there are certain texts that are a little bit more like Kohelet in terms of kind of complaining about how bad the things are and what's the solution. There's an interesting text. There's an interesting text in Egyptian called "A Conversation Between a Man and His Ba," his soul, and the man wants to commit suicide, and the soul is kind of saying at one point the soul is like, well, just have a good time now. Just drink, eat, be merry now. Like because the guy is really miserable, and the soul is kind of keeps on trying to encourage him. And finally, the soul is like, look, I'm going to be with you no matter what, but you're not going to kill yourself. You're not going to kill yourself. You've got to keep living. That seems to be kind of the end. You can argue about what the ending of that poem means, but it's not really that close a parallel to what we have. It's just interesting. So let's take a look at this, which is dialogue of Pessimism or the Obliging Slave. I could, not sure why I can't try this again. There we go. Okay. Dialogue of Pessimism or the Obliging Slave. This is a pretty nasty little piece. It is, it's Babylonian. And here we have, is there so here we have a dialogue between a master and a slave. This part is really too fragmentary. But essentially what the master does is he says, do this, and the slave, here, let's take a look. Slave, oblige me again. Here, master, here. Get a move on and get ready for me some hand ablution water and give it to me so I can sup, so I can eat. Eat, master, eat. Having supper regularly makes one content, even the supper of his God. Shamash approves of clean hands. No, slave, I definitely won't eat. Don't eat, master, don't eat. To be hungry or to eat, to be thirsty or to drink are but human. Okay, and he keeps on doing this. He keeps on saying that the master says, "I'll do this," and he's like, "Yeah, do that." And then he'll say, "So here, slave, oblige me again. Here, master, here. See here, I'll go in for skullduggery. So go in for it, master. Go in for it. If you don't go in for skullduggery, what will be your finery? Who will just give you handouts so you can fill your stomach? No, slave, I will definitely not go in for skullduggery." The man, and then the slave agrees with him. The man who goes in for skullduggery is killed, flayed, blinded, arrested, or thrown in jail. Right? Slave, oblige me again. Here, master, here. I'm going to fall in love with a woman. Fall in love, master, fall in love. The man who falls in love with a woman forgets depression and melancholy. No way, slave, I will not fall in love with a woman. Don't fall in love, but master, don't fall in love. Woman is a well, she's a well, a pit, a hole. Woman is a whetted iron dagger that cuts the throat of a fine man. Okay, so you have this back and forth. We have a similar back and forth when we read Kohelet. Like he said, I thought that this was going to be the meaning of life, but it wasn't. I thought that this was true, but it's not. And everything has its opposite. And to see just how pessimistic this is, here, slave, oblige me again. Here, master, here. I will carry out a good service for my country. So carry one out, master, carry one out. The man who carries out a good service for his country, his deeds are placed in the carrying basket of Marduk. No way, slave, I will not carry out a good service for my country. Don't carry one out, master, don't carry one out. Go up onto the ancient ruin heaps and walk about. Search out the skulls of high and low, which was a crook and which did good services, right? In other words, everyone's going to die. And this is totally a Kohelet, you can take it straight. Everyone's going to die, so what does it matter? What does it matter if you do good or not? Can you tell from the skulls that you see scattered around who did good and who was a thief? No, you can't. What does it matter, right? What does anything matter? And finally, so the final little lovely stanza here is, slave, oblige me again. Here, master, here. Now then, what is good? What's good is to break my neck and your neck and to be thrown into the river. Who is tall enough to ascend to the heavens? Who is broad enough to encompass the earth? No way, slave. I'll kill you and send you in advance. But my master wouldn't even survive me 3 days. Right? That's that lovely end to a lovely exchange between a master and a slave. So let me hold on. Okay, so that little bit of humorous dialogue is also showing a very kind of pessimistic view of the world and how meaningless everything really is, and that anything you want to do can have arguments for or against. Okay, so that's and that's kind of the Kohelet, the back and forth and back and forth and back and forth we sometimes see with Kohelet. And what is, but what kind of, so in the final analysis of the Kohelet is like, well, serve God kind of thing. And find a woman you love, settle down and live your life. And what's interesting is that we have, so there are certain differences that we see in these wisdom texts, and particularly in terms of how central God is to the whole thing, right? Where with Kohelet, serving God comes up kind of at the end to kind of help, put some meaning in life. I mean, he doesn't just show up at the end, right? But that's a main way to feel satisfied at all at the end of the book, right? In Mishlei, God is a main force in making sure that equation evens out, right? Bad for bad, good for good. God's the one who makes sure that it happens. And in Eov, it's God coming out and recognizing Eov that solves everything, right? That solves everything for Eov. It doesn't solve everything for the reader so much, right? Because God's explanation sounds like, well, I do some pretty wild stuff, so don't come and tell me that you know that he sinned, right? So that, you know, you can't understand me. So as a reader, it can be a little bit distressing. The first time I really learned Eov in depth, I didn't look ahead. And I was like, that's the answer? That's it? You know, it's such a long book too. And you just look at all the words that, you know, Eov, Job has more hapax legomena than any other book. It has more words that only show up in Eov, right? It just, but the fact is that's what that revelation, it really is, it's revelation. That revelation solves the issue for Eov, right? And there's an idea that revelation itself can make at least the sufferer feel better. And also I would like to bring up something. I see there's a comment, Moshe, just a second. Also, Mili Chokpak points out that there are certain things even when we compare, she likes to compare biblical wisdom literature with Egyptian wisdom literature, and you could actually see that there were certain things that were more important in the Judean or Israelite scribal school than in the Egyptian scribal school. For instance, learning and teaching. Teaching has a number of different words. When you, in general, when you try to figure out how important something is in a certain culture, you're like, how many words do they have for it? How many words do they use for it? And if you compare Mishle and the like to Egyptian wisdom literature, many more words for teaching and learning. Many more words, particularly for teaching, where teaching is supposed to be very, very important and central, right? And that goes beyond theological issues to the culture, right? That there's a culture of teaching. There are also certain things in terms of there was a much less pessimistic view of teaching than in Egyptian wisdom literature, where Egyptian wisdom literature was much more likely to mention like punishment, physical punishment, than biblical wisdom literature. So it's a different approach to wisdom itself in a way, and to passing on wisdom itself, which is fascinating. So I'm going to now that's it. That's what I wanted to bring to you today. I'm going to take a second and read comments. So Moshe says the skulls Theodicy thing is very reminiscent of Hillel in Avot 2:6. Moreover, he saw a skull floating on the face of the water. He said to it, because you drowned others, they drowned you. And in the end, they that drowned you will be drowned. Well, using skulls, sure, but actually what he does is exactly the opposite of what the point was of the servant. The servant said, go and just see a bunch of skulls. You have no idea what they did. And Hillel is like, I see the skull bobbing there. I know what this guy did, right? I know. He's actually applying Mishle theology. He's applying the thing. This skull is bobbing there because this guy drowned someone, right? I already know what he did. So it's actually, I mean, it uses skulls, but it's a different idea. Hamlet. Yeah, I don't remember what he says after the poor Yorick part. Does he make a comment about who cares? Who knows what he did? He acts like he recognizes Yorick from the skull. So I don't know. It's a weird thing to do. And no matter what, in any culture, I think what Hamlet is acting pretty nutty. But I don't remember what his little speech is. I don't remember if he makes a comment about who would know who Yorick was or what he did. I remember that he says he's funny, right? He said he was funny. And it clearly as a skull he isn't. So, but yeah. So, are there any other questions? Okay, so thank you for joining me. I enjoy teaching this. One more point, okay? We're going to have a 3-week break after this class, and the reason for it is next week is 1 week before Pesach. Then we have Pesach. Then we have Isru Chag and the last day of Pesach for anyone in the States. So for the next 3 weeks, we're off. and then we will return. And I will let you know what we will be learning when we return. So I haven't put up the last class on YouTube yet. I will, and I will do this one also, and I'll let you guys know when it's up. So thank you everyone for joining me. Take care, everyone. Chag Kasher v'sameach.
Service Sameach.
Pesach Sameach, Miriam.
Thanks.